We've been covering biblical principles of justice. Last hour we mentioned that the highest attainment for man is to be possessed by God as a saint. The highest law for man is that which sets a man apart for God as God's saint. The highest happiness for man is to feel the love and care of God. The highest inheritance of a man on earth is the provision by which he might pursue God unencumbered. And then lastly, justice is the preservation of a man's right to pursue God equal to others. And I'm going to take this last point, the fifth point here, and expand on it a little bit here. Justice preserves a man's right to pursue God equally to others. I'll just discuss justice a little bit from a practical application, because essential to constitutional issues is the issue of justice. Basically, the Constitution, by its existence, declares it's possible for government to behave in an unjust fashion. And so we set forth the mechanism, the declaration of what makes something just and how that justice is to be meted out. So with that in mind, I've got a little statement. Justice balances the competing rights of men so as to preserve the interests of both parties. Now, there's that implementation here of two people have rights, but when they're both expressing their rights unencumbered, they may naturally extend over and remove rights of another individual. In the highest sense of that pursuit, we're talking about the right of a man to pursue God and to pursue him by his conscience for the purpose that God designed and created man. In terms of any interest that a man might have in a government, it's a recognition of several things. First of all, it's a recognition that certain men have rights. Now, the reality is, not all governments grant rights to all men. As we mentioned before, usually there's a stricture, some form of restriction that says, well, this group of people, by nature of the group they're in, have certain rights. Usually that stricture, that restriction is based upon citizenship. That's true of the Greeks. Only 20% of the Greeks had citizenship, and it was those Greeks that participated in the democracy. Rome was very similar. You had to be a citizen of Rome. And so we assume that there's competing rights of men. We assume that there's a group of rights, and then we recognize that once you give men rights, they tend to compete with each other. So justice, the simple definition of justice here is balancing the competing rights of men to preserve the interests of both parties. So we just have that simple statement. Justice preserves the man's right to pursue God equally to others, and that's that whole element of balancing one set of rights against another. When you have the two parties perhaps being somewhat inequitable, for example, one party is the individual and the other part is the state, or one part is the federal government or the national government and the other part is the state government, or you have a competition between the state government and the local government. Anytime you have something of inequitability, it's absolutely necessary to have prescribed clearly the nature of the jurisdiction of the two realms, so that a recognition of what rights are granted and how they play themselves out can be clearly modified. I found it very interesting in my dealings with the Board of Education that the way the law of Maryland exists, the general rules that relate to how education is carried out resides in the state level of the Board of Education. However, there are 24 sub-jurisdictions, 24 local boards of education in the different counties in Baltimore City. And I found it rather, at first it was rather interesting, it began to be rather humorous to realize that there is tremendous amount of contest as the competition between the local Board of Education competes with the State Board of Education. And some of the issues that we experienced ourselves in recent years, about 3 years ago, the State Board of Education created a new regulation for homeschoolers. The reason they created that regulation for homeschoolers was the contest that was raging between the local boards of education and the commands that the State Board of Education had placed on them to carry out certain kinds of information. So three things get implied by this issue of competing interests. Number one, there's an implication of some aspect of equity. Basically, equity implies one principle only: preserves a man's right to pursue God equally to others. There's a couple issues of justice that stand out. Number one, if justice is balancing competing rights of men, there's an implication here that there's such a thing called equity. And equity is a term you might hear in different shapes and forms, but the simple understanding of what equity means is that the right that one possesses brings with it the sense of force or ought. The right implies I have this right, this privilege, by which I can conduct myself without interference, and my complaint is your behavior, your the use of your right is restricting, it's imposing itself upon mine. And so that being the case, then to understand what justice is and to understand the essence and the need for the Constitution, there has to be a mechanism for weighing the equal rights of people in a context that says these rights here are necessary, these rights here are necessary. When they overlap, there has to be a mechanism to restrict unnecessary overlapping so that no rights are restricted except the use of those rights that themselves would impose on the free use of other people's rights. And so that's the sense of equity. If you don't have equity, then you don't have standing. Let's say you have a 200-acre farm, and farmers have the right to plow their land, to hunt their land, to do all kinds of things to their land. I don't own your land, and I don't have your permission, and I decide, since you have the right to hunt and plant on your land, I would like to hunt and plant on your land. And so I bring my gun over to your house and go hunting because I want to go hunting. You protest and you say, I didn't give you permission, and I'm sorry, as much rights as you have. It's a free world. I can do whatever I want. Well, I don't have standing. There are no rights of equity that I can bring to bear upon you. Now, if you and I were brothers and we together purchased the land and we were both holding title to it, and you tried to keep me off, then we would have a contest. So you can see the difference. Incidentally, in China, it's interesting that they're just learning how to deal with property possession rights and property issues. And it's an amazing confusion that exists over there. For example, because the government has considered themselves to be the sole possessor of everything, people might possess individual little appendages like their own clothing or some hand tools of their own, or maybe even their own dwelling. They've slowly begun to have a few kinds of possessions. Well, one of the things that occurs in the Chinese law is going to have to be changed somehow, but there's a law that says if you plant a tree, you own it. So when I was visiting Tim Shell in China, looking over the 1,000-acre farm, they're leasing the farm from the government, so they pay to plant crops and what have you, but they have problems periodically with people coming in from the city, and during the night they creep in and plant trees on their property. And there's a law that you can't cut down somebody else's tree because that's their property. So it's like he's got a little section of the farm that's out of reach. All these trees are standing there. Somebody snuck in and planted. And it's like, how you even show title, I have no idea. But another picture that happens in China because of lack of property rights understanding. If you use something, then it's yours. If nobody else was using it when you started using it. So they had an empty house on this farm that they leased. And the empty house they were going to use for people that they had work on the farm. Well, it wasn't ready for somebody to live in yet, so it was empty. Well, they turned around one day and a family had moved in. They had to literally buy the house from the family that moved in order to use it, even though they already had right to it because they had paid for it already. But the convolution of property rights is so strange. And so equity is an important concept. It gives you standing in a matter of contest and jurisdiction. Number two, there's justice implies judgment. And thus there's an implication of the need for a just government to arbitrate between the rights of opposing men. I listed Isaiah 9:7 here because there's a powerful reference to the ultimate affection that the human heart has for true righteous government. Man was never ever created with the capacity to be absolutely without government, to be a libertarian in the ultimate sense of licentiousness. Man is designed to be in complete harmony with the purposes of God and the fellowship of God, and that implies government. But in 9:7, talking about the government of Christ in the millennium, when justice stands exclusively on the government of Christ, and all the workings of government are completely righteous in every fashion, and there's not one failure of just arbitration between the rights of men in that day. But again, justice implies a competition between two equitable parties. It implies the necessity of justice, that somebody fairly looks at the conditions and says, okay, well, I see your rights and I see your rights, and weighing them both together for both of your rights to have maximum expression without taking away the proper rights of others, it's going to look like this. And so we confine the rights in that equitable court of justice. And then thirdly, justice implies a higher law or a supreme code that expresses the rights of each man in relationship to his Creator. And earlier when I was sharing, I kind of got ahead of myself, but just a reminder, this is where the Declaration of Independence fits in. The Declaration of Independence, like I said earlier, is not a law, it's not a constitution, it's not a point of reference that we have established by which to conduct ourselves. The Declaration of Independence is a lawsuit by a collective body of people who proclaim to the whole world and to the throne of God that their just rights before the Almighty God, who endowed them with certain inalienable rights, that their just rights have been abridged to the point that they're making their appeal to heaven for a redress of their grievances. And the Revolutionary War was the assumption of a defense of rights that they believed God had given them, but their dependence was on God for deliverance. And sometimes there's a question that gets raised, were the rebels in the Revolutionary War just in rebellion? They didn't know how to be under authority? And you really need to understand, absolutely, the ultimate appeal that every one of us has constantly, always, every day, you and I, to this very hour, we have that constant appeal to the supreme code before the supreme Creator. And that's where our conscience rests with a primary duty that exceeds all of the other duties. I must obey God rather than man. And when I have that position of obedience to God, I may exert those rights and privileges that He has granted within the capacity that I seek Him to enable me to accomplish those rights. So what we find in, for example, 1 Timothy chapter 2, when Paul describes the conduct of the church, the first duty of the church, he declares, is for godly men to lift up holy hands and make their appeal to God for one purpose, that we might live a godly and a peaceable, quiet life for the express purpose of preaching the gospel and living quietly under the realm of God's righteousness. But that picture of a higher law is the foundation of justice. Otherwise, if there is no higher law at the foundation, then justice is simply reduced to one concept: might makes right. If I'm strong enough to overcome your rights, if I'm powerful enough to abridge your rights so that I can take from you what I please, then that's what justice is. And if you read the book carefully, there was that section on Greek thought concerning law. And that was the whole Greek line of reasoning as they came to try to express what is ultimate justice. What is ultimate justice in the sense of an individual's rights? And though the Greeks were not necessarily Unitarians, I mean, though they didn't worship one God, they worshiped many, yet in the pursuit of discussing of justice, even Greek thought moved towards the ultimate idea that above all there's one supreme God and there's one supreme source of rights that comes from God. And though we might feel compelled to use a small g for their definition of God, yet in their pursuit of justice, they were compelled to appeal to the highest bench of authority, God himself, and to the highest assumption of rights that, being human being grants an individual certain rights that he should be enabled to carry out. So this is the essence of justice as it relates to the Constitution. Continuing on the next panel, true justice requires that individual man and collective man seek every man's interest and not just his own. It should be his own and not their own, to keep the number proper. True justice requires that individual man and collective man seek every man's interest and not just their own. And again, that's another very simple way of summarizing justice in the ultimate sense of the word. I am obligated not only to attempt to secure my own rights and my own interests, but I'm also obligated to procure and secure and preserve your rights in the process of pursuing my own. And that's the ultimate expression of justice. I have three little points that spring out of this. Number one, freedom cannot be defined except in terms of justice. It's really important for us to understand the inseparable nature of justice and freedom. In the Bible, Galatians 5, there's a warning. Stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ has set you free, and be not again entangled in bondage. So there's the call to use liberty, but then there's the warning. But don't use your liberty as an excuse, as a licentious occasion to simply please the flesh and to please yourself. But rather, you use your liberty as the occasion to do the will of God. So you cannot have freedom without having justice. And when you have freedom and justice together, justice always demands that one man's freedom, that one man's rights, that one man's liberty are barred at the point of which another equitable individual holding those same rights, that those rights are in no way abridged by the use of my own freedom. The second point here, freedom and justice center upon the individual and his or her value before God. Again, this is where I kind of gave some illustrations in the last hour about how you and I, by nature, tend to value with a worldly reference. Something is valuable by worldly reference. And I was sharing a little bit of the exposure that I had in Guatemala, recognizing people didn't value themselves. And I think I was the most astonished by it. I was immersed in this culture for multiple days, and then suddenly I was transferred back to the airport, and I suddenly was immersed back into a large group of Americans. And I perceived immediately that one of the major differences between the Americans that I was observing and the Guatemalans that I was observing was their own self-sense of their own value. And it's like the Americans valued themselves and they projected themselves with that sense of value, and there was as it were a sense of protection for them. There was a sense of honor. They sort of let you know, not directly, but they let you know they had every right that you had to be there and interacting on whatever the situation was. Whereas the Guatemalan people that have been abused by poverty and carelessness and disregard through corruption in their government, etc., many of those people live on the edge of discouragement and a low self-esteem, undervaluing themselves, and they project that undervalue in the relationship with man. And it's important for us to recognize that freedom and justice always center upon the individual's value before God. God values people. And the ultimate verse for this, now we spent some time in it several weeks ago, but Genesis 9 might be the verse you just put in the margin here as a reference point. The substantive introduction of human government centered around one question. Man is made in the image of God, and so God reserves to himself exclusively the right to determine the nature of a human life. And so universally, man is excluded from being the discerner or the judge of the value of another life. And the only power that government really has been granted to man in terms of God's use of capital punishment, basically God has ordained that no matter who it is, if a human being's life is abridged by another human being, then society must abridge the life of that other individual, clearly and simply because you took a human life, and that human life is made in the image of God. And so government forces, the justice system that God has forces us to recognize that though I cannot perceive someone else's value, yet I must grant it. That's the nature of justice. I grant the equal value of another soul and life equal to me. And of course, when you start looking at how justice is carried out in courts over the world, over the years of history, you know, how often is it that a wealthy person of importance and high standing in a community is given preferential treatment when their crimes come before a court versus another individual who perhaps in poverty and in want appears to be of less significance to the culture at large. And so it's much easier, if you just trace judgments given by courts in history, it's much easier to recognize courts judging poor people are harsher in a pattern than courts judging, you know, wealthy or respected people. That's a pattern that you can find. It's not acceptable before God, but that's the nature of injustice. And so lastly, point number 33 here, the focus of true justice is upon the most at risk and the weakest members of society. If you really want to have a just society, you've really got to zero primarily in on those members of society. They're at greatest risk of having their God-given rights abridged by others who have the power and the capacity to do so. One little comment here, read through the Old Testament and be amazed at the number of times when God speaks about justice and proper judgment in the court of law. He repeatedly draws attention to the fact that widows and orphans are so often the object of injustice as people take advantage of those that are helpless because they don't have a father, they don't have a husband, and it's easy to take advantage of those individuals in society. But true justice must focus on the most at risk and the weakest members of society. And that's why in our day, from the year that my wife and I were married, 33 years now, the greatest abrogation of justice in our culture has been the abortion, the so-called right to abortion, as some 45 million helpless unborn children have failed to be given any form of acknowledgement and justice because they're simply the weak members of society that have no one to defend and speak. And their value to the fullness of life and that full potential has been diminished, and it's been set against the mere rights of individuals who want convenience or some form of self-consideration as they imagine that somehow raising a child is more than they should be expected to do. And I think here we move on to the next panel, preaching the gospel. If justice preserves a man's right to pursue God equally to others, then preaching the gospel is the most crucial and effective influence upon the individual and society. And it's the chief means of reform for both. This is important for you and I to understand as Christians. We have the most incredible place in culture and in time, whether it be our own generation or just overall in the history of man, because the nature of the gospel is one thing. I have Matthew 11:5 here. There's also a similar passage in Mark and Luke. But Jesus' description of the nature of his ministry: the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. That is a profound picture and statement of the nature of the ministry of Christ as he came to earth. It's not that he came to just give the blind some time to see before they died. It's that by giving the blind sight, there was the statement of equity, that the purpose that God has for man is to see. And of course, there's the spiritual recovery of blindness of eyesight is far more significant and superior to the physical recovery. But in each one of these cases, we're talking about the rejects of a society. The blind, the lame, the lepers, the deaf, and the dead. Those people all have no common standing in a society. Even today, it's so difficult for us to give recognition or consideration to people. Someone says that when they're blind, one of the frustrations in talking to other people is that the person talking to them yells at them, shouts, speaks real loudly, because they assume that since they're blind, they're half deaf also. And it's just that natural instinct that we have as humans to lack capacity to give value and to give a sense of equity to the people that have some limitation in terms of physical deformity or defect. And then, of course, the poor. The poor is the only condition here in this mention that's not a physical deformity, but all of these deformities give a person non-status in a society. And basically, the whole purpose of the ministry of Christ was to give proper status to that group of people of whom this world gives no status at all. One of the things that we're going to find equitably in heaven is that the individuals that society has just looked right past and acted like they didn't exist or they were unimportant, that those individuals are going to be prominent in heaven. We're going to be astonished. We're going to say, where were you? We never saw you. You lived on my street. How did that happen? And there's going to be astonishment because we have such little capacity to discern and recognize value in those who aren't naturally whole, as it were. 2 quick points. Number 1, oppression often robs the individual of their own self-respect, such as slavery. And I gave you that little story of the slave saying there was 4 of them that were sold that day. 4 mules, 7 that were sold, 4 mules and 3 slaves. And then this second point here, the gospel is a message of hope to individuals and reform society to preserve the hope. Here's the importance of preaching the gospel. Imagine entering into someone else's sphere of their life and they have no sense of value. They look down on themselves. They don't consider themselves worth living. They have adopted the world's negative rejection of who they are. And you bring to them the expression of value and hope and significance. When that person gains that equitable spirit of value and of hope and purpose, and they see themselves as made in the image of God, designed by God to know Him, and when they have actually the experience of redemption, whereby God transforms them from the inside out, then that person is fully rehabilitated in the sense of justice because they have everything that any man could ever hope for. Let me make 2 quick points here. Before I was saved, I was struggling, let me go back, I was struggling to sort of find footing of what the purpose and the value of life is, and I tried to discern, well, what's happiness? I ought to pursue happiness. And I couldn't really answer that very philosophically. And I thought, well, I guess happiness is doing something you like. Well, the only thing I like doing is playing basketball. So with that little narrow judgment, I said, well, I guess for me then, life equals basketball. Happiness equals playing ball. So I decided, well, I'm going to try to be a professional basketball player because that's what life is for me. If I don't get to be a basketball player, I guess I won't have life. So I kind of made a commitment to basketball, and I actually had a vision and a goal that was useful in getting somewhere, as it were. But in the quietness of the back of my mind, as I was sitting there making that discernment, making that judgment to, live my life for basketball, a real quiet little voice said, "And what happens to you when you get in an accident and your legs are cut off and you can't play basketball? So does that mean then you don't have life anymore?" And it was one of those thoughts, I heard and I stuffed because I didn't have an answer, but I realized, the truth of it is, if you find the real value of life, it's totally unrelated to your physical stature or your earthly accomplishments. And there was this little sense of, when I find what really life is all about, it'll be equally true for me if I'm full of life, limb, and abilities, or if I'm this vegetative person lying in bed and the only thing that I can do is bat an eyelash to communicate and interact with the world around me. I realize that the fullness of life has to be satisfactory, completely satisfactory for that person that's totally incapacitated in human terms. I got saved within the year. I was saved within a 12-month period of that original decision. And I remember sitting in my room contemplating what now was this inexorable joy of the Lord, just knowing God and having that relationship with God in a vital way. And I remember realizing this is it. If I was crippled so that all I could do was bat an eyelash, nothing could be added or taken from me in terms of my happiness, because the fullness of knowing God was having God Himself enter into my life, fill me with joy, and give me a sense of value and purpose. And that's the essence of what the gospel is. It's a giving of hope to individuals, and it also reforms society. It reforms society by changing the rules of engagement. The gospel says everyone has value. People who fall asleep in my class have as much value as people who stay awake in my class. Everybody has value. Oh, you see people waking up all over the place. But value comes from God, and so the gospel influences that sense of value, and it upgrades value. In every culture that the gospel has gone to, it has corrected the devaluing mechanisms of that society as it relates to the value of people, especially those that were the least, the last, and the lost. Well, let's move on. Roman numeral 2. I'm going to make a quick review of a couple points we made last time because of the substantive impact on understanding constitutional government. First of all, back in Genesis, the establishment of the family is the first form of government. And there's a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, the family was a mixed form of government. It was monarchical in nature with respect to the husband and his role as head. It's aristocratic in nature in respect to the mother and their father's role as they were parents and give jurisdiction and direction to children. And yet there's an element of democratic, meaning the voice of the child is heard through his tears. And it's just interesting. I love this picture. God in His sovereign wisdom, though He established the structure of government in the family, yet He didn't leave it totally succumbed to just an authoritarian ruler. He has these elements that intertwine and intermingle. And there's some jokes about how powerful the tears of a child are. When you have one question, what does it take to get the kid to stop crying? It's like that simple protest of a need not being met rises up to give value to the primary sense of purpose to what the nature of a family is and the purpose of parents in taking care of children. Secondly, the family is a simple constitutional federated government. That's a mouthful. You're going to say, how is that? Well, first of all, that's a reflection of our American system, so I'm just illustrating it in an aspect here. But first of all, it's constitutional. Its powers are derived and limited by the Word of God. And I think it's important to understand and recognize that, from a fundamental standpoint, without the record of Scripture, we wouldn't have much more than just natural reason to indicate that parents have certain rights and married couples have certain responsibilities. But the Scripture aids substantially in outlining those powers and duties in the Scripture. So it's constitutional in that there's a resource, there's an authoritative resource outside of the parents to which they're called to. Most interesting part of family is the nature of family court. You say, well, family court, you're supposed to have family court? Oh, there's no real formal family court mentioned in the Scriptures at all, but it happens all the times. A family court is nothing more than people protesting that their rights are being abridged by the imposition of other people's wills. And the nature of the family court kind of swings along the lines of the imposition of one will and the rebellion and the rejection or the protest of those who don't want to be under that will. But in the element of family court, in the constitutional aspect, how many children have said, Dad, you're not supposed to provoke me to wrath? That's an appeal in family court to the Constitution. Or how many wives have said to their husbands, you're supposed to love me like Christ loved the church? That's making an appeal in the family court to the Constitution. Or how many husbands have said to their wives, you're supposed to be in submission to me. I'm mentioning that humorously, partly because it's so true. In our interactions at home, we often hold court by bringing up the Constitution and trying to persuade our rights in the family center. But the reality is, of course, wouldn't it be far better for us to live by the part of the Constitution that rules over our own activities, such as children, obey your parents in the Lord? You know how many parents bring that up? Well, supposed to do this. Everybody ought to focus on their duty, and we have a little bit more peace and quiet in a home. But it's also, the family is also federated, that the power is shared between the husband and the wife, and that aspect of ruling the children. So I use this as an illustration because this sort of parallels the nature of the American government system. Family also operates by checks and balances. There's an interaction of various interests that conserves the overall interest of individual against individual interests. And what you basically have here is, I already kind of illustrated it. The husband is concerned with the physical well-being, the wife is concerned with the relational well-being, and the child is usually just focused on their own well-being. But those three realms of concern interact and create the natural sense of checks and balances. And when you see harmony in a home, you see somebody using their jurisdiction to promote the well-being of another. When you see disharmony in a home, you see somebody taking their liberty and satisfying their own pleasure, satisfying their own interests to the loss of others to whom they're called to serve. Also, just a quick reference to the Jewish model of justice as it relates to our own heritage in our constitutional form of government. But the Jewish model was also a constitutional federal republic from the standpoint that, number one, Israel had a mixed form of government. It had an administrative branch. The administrative branch was primarily the priesthood. They took care of representing God to man and taking the sacrifices of the people and overruling general needs of man. But there also was an occasional non-priest who would be a judge that would enter into that administrative element, but they would usually be more part of the judicial branch. But you also have the legislative area here, and that is, God gave laws. We had laws given for the general morality in society, but these laws were given directly by God. And so what you really find, even in the days of the kings, the primary purpose of the government was implementation, or the administrative implementation of the law, versus the creating of law. They were carefully and specially created by God. And then number three, there's the judicial part of the Jewish model. And the judicial system included essentially a Supreme Court and the appeal to Moses, or the highest judge of the land, which in later days was the king. It also included lower courts, where they had established representatives in groups of 100, 50, and 10. Of course, the lowest court would be the court of 10, where you would make your small appeal to the leader of 10. But failing that, you would go to the ruler of 50, which would be the rulers of the 10. Failing that, you would go to the rulers of 100, etc. So in a quick summary then, Israel was monarchical in the sense the final authority was vested in one individual, such as Moses. It was also republican in that its representatives resolved issues in the city gates. These groups of leaders came right out equitably from the different families of the nation. And then also it was constitutional in that it was ruled by a higher law established over men by God. Now, from the standpoint of just reviewing Roman influence, I've mentioned this a little bit already at the earlier part of the lecture, but three substantive things came out of the general influence from the Roman model. The rule of law came out. Basically, the rule of law made an appeal to justice to a divine entity. There is a higher law to which to make an appeal that overrules all other law. The Roman influence also was representational. The rights of the citizens, privately and collectively, are preserved by representation. It is true that we copied, in some respects, the form of government that the Romans had. We named our Senate the Senate directly after the Roman use and term of the name Senate. But also, there was an interesting aspect with the Roman Empire because it was so vast and large that there was a federal aspect to Roman government. This is really clearly seen in Scripture. When you find Jesus being crucified, what you have is the Jewish court making a claim that Christ was violating Jewish laws and customs. And there was an aspect in the federal law that the Roman Empire granted to local regions their local laws and customs as best suited that people and their religion and what have you. So that court that the Jews established was not only a Jewish court by Jewish tradition, but it was also a court that was authorized by the Roman government as well. However, there were some restrictions. So when they reached the death penalty verdict, they said, well, we can't carry out the death penalty because we don't have that authority under the Roman law. So then they made their appeal to the Roman government, the Roman consul, which was Pilate. And then Pilate tried to dodge the bullet by saying, well, wait a minute, he's from Galilee, well, he needs to go down to Herod. That's the right jurisdiction. And he came back. But we see this practice of recognizing regional interests in the manner in which government was carried out in local regions. So we see basically local regional interests versus central government interests. And we found America modeled ourselves after that. The states represented the regions and the interests of those regions, and the states had preserved to them the necessary interests and practices that were appropriate for their region. Roman numeral 5 here steps in framing our Constitution. Just a quick touch on some of the issues. First issue, which we mentioned multiple times here, a distrust of power is the chief reason for the need for checks and balances. And the framing of the Constitution is primarily a framework of how we can create checks and balances against injustice, against the abuse of power. Remember, in a mixed form of government, there's a distrust of a ruling elite, whether it be a monarch exclusively or an aristocratic small regime, but there's also a distrust of the majority, where everybody has a say in every matter every day, and you rule by majority, and you have majority rule abridges the rights of private individuals. Ruling by the elite can abridge the rights of the majority. So it's the competition between those two that create the sense of balancing power in three branches of government. Also, a reminder here of the conscience issue. Conscience towards God is the ultimate answer of an individual to higher law. And that, in a sense, again, just a reminder, that's the ultimate correction to bad government. At first it seems futile that the ultimate correction to bad government is for myself to die, to lose my life under an unjust government. But the reality of a person's willingness to surrender their life pretty much restricts this kind of conscience issue to its highest level to Christians who have the hope of eternal life by resurrection. And so what we find is the introduction of a higher authority and a greater hope than this life has to offer, which motivates people who are suffering from injustice. So what we had saw in the history from the time of the Roman Empire, the answer of a man's conscience by which he laid down his life in hope of eternal life so influenced the Roman Empire that in a short 200 to 300 year time frame, the whole entire sense of the value of Christianity spread rampantly across the Roman Empire, as people who were oppressed by Roman rule began to have a hope that exceeded this life, and the influence of Christianity largely springs from the answer of a conscience towards God. Fourth point here in the steps of framing our Constitution, some of the issues there is the free pursuit of one's personal family interests defines what liberty and justice is. You constantly have a temptation with any form of government to ask the question, whose interests are being preserved and established by law? And in a free society, the establishment of the individual liberty and the expression of justice as the procuring of that individual's liberty as the foundation for what justice is, that establishes this dynamic of liberty where there's a free pursuit of one's personal family interests, as is seen in our country. The Founding Fathers called it in the Declaration of Independence the pursuit of happiness. And then lastly here, in terms of issues relating to the framing of our Constitution, the sense of representation springs from the principle that if I have an interest that needs to be guarded in the government, then there needs to be a mechanism by which my interests are represented in that government. And so representational government, or Republican government, is the larger issue of recognizing that because I have an interest, an equitable interest that others have, then I need to have a mechanism by which my interests can be represented in the government and how it's carried out. And that's what we spent a little bit of time earlier this morning on, recognizing the substantial influence that believers can have and the mechanism by which we rightfully pursue our interests within the context of our government. Concerning the framing of our Constitution and the foundation, this is just a quick summary of 3 issues here. The source of the higher law is the righteous Creator. And while the discussion of righteousness and those kind of issues don't find themselves in any details in the establishment of our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence sort of lays the foundation that that's the source of our highest appeal, that there's something called God's way is the only right way. And so when I appeal to God and I'm appealing to His way, I'm appealing to the highest place of righteousness. And so 3 things flow out of that concept of higher law, and that is the origin of human purpose, to please and to know God, and to be known of God. The origin of human duty, man is obligated to answer to God those things by which God has commanded and put upon him. And so that higher law not only compels me to pursue God, but also it compels me to obey Him. And then thirdly, the basis of the ultimate appeal between men is not primarily asserting my rights over another man in some sharp argument of personal contention, but rather it's a larger appeal back to a Creator. When my equitable stand in front of the Creator is established, then equity is established on equal footing for all, whether one appears to be great or small. One of the words you might want to look up in a concordance sometime, double the words, enter into your computer, great and small, and find some references that just pop out immediately. One of the common things that New Testament justice singles on is that God doesn't get moved by what moves men. And the things that are highly valued among men are an abomination to the Lord. And so when the Lord, it's like Revelation 20, resurrection of the lost occurs, and it says the sea gave up her dead, and then it describes the dead in these terms, great and small. Then it gives all the extremes of society, the kings and the poorest and the least, They're all brought forward equitable judgment before God in the last day, of which eternity and their standing in eternity is judged and ruled from how they conducted themselves before God equitably on the earth. And then B, concerning the foundation of our Constitution, the need for higher law is and the need for just judgments. You know, the bottom line is you don't need government unless you need somebody making a just decision between two people. You have no need for government at all. But because you have equitability in rights and interests and the ability to impinge upon one another's rights and equitability, then the whole nature of the foundation of the Constitution is we've got to have a foundation for just judgments that's not arbitrarily resting in people who possess authority, but it's clearly and equitably related to a foundation of higher law. So competing equitable rights are reserved, and mechanisms for resolving equity, which, you know, I'm using terminology here for simplicity's sake, but a mechanism to reserve equality means a judicial system, a mechanism by which we can come before a judge and say, hey, I'm being abused by my neighbor. And then the third foundation here I've listed is that the universal appeal to the higher law is illustrated in the Declaration of Independence, and that is the law. The Declaration of Independence is important for our understanding of a Constitution because it's the trump of every man's appeal. I do not have rights because I secured them by a government who granted them. I have rights because I'm created in the image of God, and He has granted them to me, and I may appeal to them without fear because God Himself is the grantor of them. And so that large and significant appeal to the court of heaven and every man's conscience is the final expression of true foundation for constitutional law. It's the basis for adjudicating the injustice and the overextension of law, which is the very founding of our country. But I do want you to understand the difference between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a court action before the court of heaven to gain rights granted by God. That's the nature of the Constitution. The Constitution is the document by which men can appeal for their rights among men in a court of justice on the earth. How constitutional representative government works. Quick summary here. The United States government is the constitutionally federated republic. Three things stand out. It's constitutional in nature. That means there's a rule of law. And that Constitution is the highest appeal that controls all of the government as well as all the people. It's federated in that it's divided between the interests of various parties. And the most significant picture of federation in our government is that of the national government and also the state governments representing the different interests of regions and individuals. And then thirdly, it's a republic, again the term republic meaning representation of the public in a mixed form of government. And we do have a mixed form of government. We do not have a democracy. We have a republic, and a republic is a mixed form of government. We have the presidency, which has a singular possession of administrative oversight and care. That's the administrative branch. We have the aristocracy, which is the nature of the Senate, and the judiciary, a more elite group of individuals appointed and assigned to care for the interests of both the state and the people in a competing sense. And then thirdly, we have the democracy, which is the equitable representation of every individual citizen in a jurisdiction. By the way, even that is abused today when they include illegal aliens or illegal immigrants in counting the number of citizens in a jurisdiction at the 10-year census by which they assign representation. So when you have large bands of illegal aliens counted in, you increase the rights of that state to speak in terms of numbers from the ordinary citizens. main features of the Constitution. I have a couple quick more panels here. It's the supreme law of the land, and that means primarily that there is no other higher form by which we can appeal in a court. And let me explain the difference. You cannot try the Declaration of Independence in the Supreme Court, because the Declaration of Independence is a trial in the Supreme Court of earth, which is the court before all men in the presence of God, God being the judge. So it's important that we distinguish between the supreme law of the land, which the government engages in judgment, versus the supreme law of man, which is his conscience before God in the court of public opinion. Now, it establishes the purposes of government. Our Constitution establishes the purposes of government. This is all from the preamble. To form a more perfect union, the idea of a perfect union meaning a proper association between the states and the national government. To establish justice, that's a clear purpose of government, to establish justice, meaning the equitable rights of the individuals in a balanced acknowledgement of those rights between each other. To ensure domestic tranquility, that probably has some manifold potential meanings. Obviously, if you have a state of injustice, the loss of rights by individuals, remove tranquility, and you can end up with a certain kinds of domestic violence or what have you. But there potentially also can be a consideration here as to what degree government assists in the smooth flow and interaction between citizens. Building of highways and traffic lights and all these type of things tend to have a shadow here in what tranquility means in a society. To provide for a common defense, really here speaking of the national defense, and to promote the general welfare of the people and the government. Basically, it's a little bit similar to tranquility, to secure the blessings of liberty, not only to ourselves but to our children, to our future generations. These are all the purposes of the government established by the Constitution in its preamble. And while we don't make much appeal to this, it does give the guiding principles of what the intention is behind the Constitution. Thirdly, it establishes the rights and duties of people. And the Constitution establishes certain rights. I just have a little panel here kind of comparing the rights and the duties. If I have a right to freedom of worship, my duty implied is that there's a duty for man to honor God. If I have a right to freedom of speech, there's an assumption that there's a purpose of speech, which is to speak truth and bring equity through speaking truth. If there's a freedom of press, then there's also a recognition that the accurate expression of truth and information brings people at the place where they can become properly informed and make sound judgments. If I have a freedom to vote, there's an implied duty then I need to participate in that government and be a part of it. Personally, I want to encourage us to understand just voting for somebody isn't where it stops. Active and proactive involvement in government in terms of seeking for your, using your rights and applying them as you can is a part of that whole concept of participation in voting. Freedom to own property also implies a proper use of property and good stewardship, a freedom to be able to secure the kind of employment that you desire, implies also the sense of responsibility. Government's not responsible to provide you with a certain level of income or a certain degree of happiness with your employment. The duty for you to take responsibility for your own education and training, to have a useful career is your responsibility. And then lastly, the freedom of assembly is the area where our capacity to influence society is substantially stated. It's interesting that the press is very influential in our culture today, almost to the point of debilitating the nature of the freedom to assemble. But here the freedom of assembly is not only the orderly assembly of duly elected government bodies, but it's also the private assembly of individuals in any fashion by which they sense and seek the desire to influence society for its good overall as they understand it. So that freedom to assemble is a part of both the right and the duty. Main features of the Constitution are as follows. It's a limited federal government whereby there's a separation of powers with 3 branches of government. And by the way, that little handout I gave you has little charts and simple flows of this, and you've spent time reading the book. So this is just a recap here. Also, number 2, there's a distinguishing in terms of federating between states and central or national government. So there's a limited government in that aspect of both separation of powers and division of duties between state and national interests. It's a representative government or republic, and so it deals with both an original form of government and the General Assembly, and also it's been somewhat modified as from the 17th Amendment. And what I want to mention here in terms of this original form of government is just a little bit of an understanding about the structure of the old Roman style government and then some of the changes that have occurred in our system. Originally, state governments were given the authority to select 2 senators to represent that state. And so it would be the Maryland General Assembly that would have an election, and the Maryland General Assembly would select 2 senators that would represent Maryland. And it was the 17th Amendment that changed that to have a popular vote. But there was that, the purpose for that was wrapped up in this whole concept of the division of authority between the state and the national interest, and essentially the state had the capacity to diminish federal activity by recalling their senators and installing senators that would take care of the state's needs in a satisfactory fashion. I don't know the history or the reason for the 17th Amendment and why it was put to general election, but it is important to understand that in the sequence of the process, the National Senate was responsible through an electoral process to elect the President of the United States, and those forms have been changed so that we have a little bit more general election. In the last couple elections with President Bush, you might have heard some complaining that, for example, Al Gore supposedly received more votes in terms of individual votes than President Bush did, but President Bush received more electoral votes. Well, the structure of that and how that works has to do with the fact that the states were granted the right to mandate what their votes were. And so what you had is an individual state, for example, could potentially have 27 electoral votes. So if the majority of people voted in that state for a particular president, then all 27 electoral votes were given to that candidate. Well, what that did was that still grants to the states some preservation of their interests. The Senate and the presidential election is the only means that there is basically left in our culture to secure some safety net for the states and their rights. If we allow the Electoral College, as it's called, to be set aside under the cry for more direct election by pure popular vote, what you actually do is you undermine further the state's rights of certain regions, so that an entire regional government can be overwhelmed by, for example, New York City can dictate to Kansas how Kansas ought to survive or live, because New York City has a larger population. They can throw their weight around. So it's a big issue what representative government is, and it has changed form, and there's pressure at this time to continue to press this away from the strict federal separation of powers to more and more a populist or a democratic type of a voting machine. The Constitution at a quick glance, I realize in this government class, this is probably a very thin presentation of the Constitution, but I'm assuming that you've done your homework in your reading. But real quickly, there's Articles 1 to 3. They simply define the separation of powers. Article 4 identifies the nature of states' rights and how they're secured and preserved. Article 5 discusses how the Constitution can be amended. Article 6 and 7 deals with how the Constitution is declared to be the supreme law of the land and how it can be changed by a proper majority, a supermajority. And then after the 7th article, we get the Bill of Rights. In the little handout that I gave you, I believe there's something like 2,700 amendments have been offered to the Constitution in the history of our country. And outside of the Bill of Rights, there's only been 17 amendments that have made it. And a handful of those have been in the last 100 years with respects to the more modern era.